Who are your favorite writers and why?
I guess I always liked F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Great Gatsby was always my favorite novel because it sort of combined great characterization and very vivid writing with a sort of fast-paced plot. I kind of,
Yeah.
unlike a lot of literary authors or books, I like sort of a fast-moving plot, a page turner combined with all the other things that typically characterize a literary novel, which is great characterization and great writing and lyrical writing. And but I like an involving plot too, and I always felt that Fitzgerald's book, that book in particular, was very involving and engaging. So he was always my favorite. I One of my more recent favorites is Thomas Wolfe, because I started reading his book because his books, like Look Homeward Angel, he's a contemporary of Fitzgerald's,
Yeah.
was also semi-biographical, like my book. He wrote about his family, and he wrote about his father was alcoholic, and his mother ran a boarding house in, not sure which city it was. Was it Memphis? It was a southern city. And he
Mhm.
writes about his huge family and all the problems that they have, and him trying to grow up and go through college. And he wrote three books. I only read the first one, but I just really could feel a sense of kinship with him and sort of struggling to write about his family at the same time as he was writing fiction and deciding just to fictionalize that at the same time.
How did your experience with playwriting affect the creation of You Can See More From Up Here?
My playwriting background definitely had a strong influence on my novel writing, and a number of people have commented. Some have complained that my scenes with dialogue go on too long and they're too play-like. And but I like you. I feel that it's one of my strong points is
Yeah.
dialogue, and that I can bring out a lot of characterization through dialogue without necessarily having to write summary and narrative. So yeah, I do. I find that I think some of the best scenes in the book are those that are dialogue based. The last scenes with Manny and Connie and Walker, the scenes in the hospital between the sister and the brother, and when Connie walks into the hospital room and pays her respects, and or the scene when they're talking about the same scene where Walker's finding out that he's been willed this Cadillac, and his whole disbelief and misunderstanding of how that can be possible. And I just think the dialogue provides you in some ways a much greater insight into a character and the way they behave as they talk.
How do you decide when it's time to end a chapter? Because I noticed that you occasionally mix in the timelines within a chapter, but then other times you would start a chapter with a new like time frame.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think part of the answer to that question is, and this is something I learned in the Novel Incubator program, which is a great program for teaching some general theory about how novels work and what makes them work.
Yeah.
Um, and we read a variety of different types of books and talked about a variety of different kinds of way books can be structured. And when I started adding this 2004 timeline, um, I did a lot of studying on other books that did the same kind of thing. Like I say, the Angle of Repose book, which went back and forth between the past and present. And I thought and this is something my teacher at the Novel Incubator program, her name is Michelle Hoover, she taught us is that if you're going to have an unusual structure, you have to sort of teach your reader how to read your book. And I thought, if I'm going to go back and forth, I'm going to do it right at the beginning, sort of quickly, a few paragraphs here in the past, a few in the present, and then I started gradually lengthening those sections so that it would be longer in the past, longer in the present, and then whole chapter. So the first chapter is really going back and forth between past and present, and then the second and third chapters, I think I'm starting to work longer sections in the past, longer sections in the present, and then that sort of sets the tone for the rest of the book. So I'm teaching the reader at the beginning. I'm saying, look, this is how this book's going to work. We're going to jump back and forth, and you're going to have to get comfortable with it and not freak out. And as we get further into the book, you'll see that it's going to become easier, and it's not going to jump back and forth quite so much, but you know that this is going to happen. This is the way the book works. So that's sort of how I created the structure of the book, thinking I needed to sort of teach the reader how this is going to work, so that as they read through, they become comfortable with it. It might be useful for you to know that the first draft of this book was entirely set in 1974. I didn't have any of the business going on in the hospital in 2004, and in a way, there was sort of that was a huge missing sense of the characterization of who Walker was, because when people read that without having the context of seeing the books from 30 years, or the character's life from 30 years later, they didn't like the character of Walker. They thought he was kind of spoiled and kind of selfish, and he was a spoiled little rich kid, and why is he complaining all the time? And there was no perspective on him, and I thought there's something missing from the book, because I was sort of writing about myself, and I said, yeah, I was sort of that way myself. I'm writing about who I was, but I don't think of myself as having been that person. So I wanted to put it in perspective, and so I thought I really need to show what he thinks of himself years later and how he's changed and grown and become a different person, so that maybe people won't think this way about him. So after that draft, I sat down and thought I really need to sort of give this different perspective from maybe years later that show how he has changed and how he's matured. And just in terms of general chapter breaks, and this is, again, something I learned in the incubator program, but I've always sort of, I think, intuited as I've read books, was that a good chapter has to have sort of an arc to it. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and end, and it has to go through sort of a dramatic rise and fall where something dramatic happens, and then there's sort of a denouement in each chapter. And I tried to do that with each chapter, and it reminds me that as I sent back this latest revision to the book to Betsy, there was one chapter, I'm trying to think which one it was. Oh, it was the chapter where Walker sees Kurt for the first time in the hospital in the present, and Kurt hunts him down and finds him writing in an emergency room. And I had rewritten that for Betsy in my first revision, and I started rereading that again for my second revision. I thought, this doesn't work. The arc is gone, that it sort of ends in the middle of the chapter. And I thought, why did I do that? It doesn't work now. So I went back and I reread the earlier version, which was twice as long. And I realized, well, I must have done that because I was trying to cut the number of words. But I ruined the chapter in the process. I took away the arc. I took away the rise and the fall. And so I put it back in. I said, I got to make the chapter work. It doesn't matter if I'm adding a few hundred words back in, because the chapter has to work properly. So that's why I reverted back to the prior version. So I'm always conscious of there sort of being a rise and a fall and a denouement in each chapter I write. And that's, you sort of get a feel for that after a while. And it's something you also get from playwriting too, that playwriting scenes where you go to a blackout always have to have sort of a rise and fall in them too. It's sort of a dramatic either cliffhanger or a change or something that happens to shift the mood from positive to negative or negative to positive, and that's how you end the chapter.
What are your favorite movies and why?
Favorite movies? I like all kinds of movies. I like Shawshank Redemption, which has a wonderful plot. That's the Stephen King story. I like science fiction movies like Inception, that had that really crazy plot with dreams going inside dreams going inside dreams. So I like science fiction. Actually, I have to admit I liked Green Book because I thought it was very entertaining, and I felt very conflicted about that afterwards because I could see why people felt that the book was sort of not racist, but sort of the white savior and the what they call the magic Negro, those plot elements of them each saving each other in each way. But I thought the plotting of that movie and that it was very entertaining, and I could understand why it became Best Picture, and I could also understand the controversy behind it. And I also like movies that are very, I like superhero movies that have very fantastic graphics. I used to be a graphic designer, and I liked playing with computer graphics, so I like those kind of movies too. But they all tend to be the same. I just sort of enjoy them for the graphics. But movies like Green Book and Shawshank Redemption that have good old fashioned plot twists and turns, like I say, fast moving plots. Those are the kind of movies I like a lot.
What readership do you have in mind for this novel, if any, and how did this affect the way that you chose to organize your narrative?
It's a good question. I guess I really sort of got a sense of who my readership was when I was early in the process of writing this book. I used an online writers group called Scribophile. If you're interested in having a writers group and you don't have any real life people around you to help you read your book and provide feedback, if you go to Scribophile, they allow you to upload your book in chapters, and then people will respond to it and write comments, and they can put edits and so forth in it. And I mention that because there was one particular woman who was in a group of people who were reading my novel, and she was an older woman about my age, and she was from Texas, I think, and she could totally relate to the book based on a lot of the historical stuff that she got into, like cruising and the Nixon era, and cultural references that I talk about, and the immigration references. And I suspect that that's probably the kind of reader who will most appreciate the book, people who lived in that era. I certainly don't want to restrict my readership. I hope I can attract some younger readers just by making it a sort of a page turner. But I suspect that baby boomers and people who like Thomas Wolfe or Elena Ferrante. Have you read any of her novels? She also writes sort of semi-biographical books, and people who like sort of literary fiction, obviously.
What advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Read a lot. Read as much as you can. Try to read a variety of different things. I read everything. I read fantasy and science fiction, and I read books by people from around the world. I don't know, and I wouldn't normally know. Right now, I'm reading Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward, which is presents me with the culture that I've been familiar with through other books like Toni Morrison and other authors, but I haven't really delved into that culture lately, and it's a fascinating, extremely well-written book. So that's one thing you should read as much as you can so that you can get a sense of how to create different kinds of voices and different kinds of environments and settings, and learn more about the world. So reading more is one thing, but also as you're writing, make sure you get feedback. Make sure that you get people to read your stuff, and that you're open to feedback, and that you're willing to make changes. And when you are getting feedback, get feedback from a number of different people so that you can get a sense of consensus of what's working and what's not. So, for instance, with this, I told you about Scribophile, which was an online group, and I had 5 or 6 different people reading my book at the same time and commenting on it at the same time as sort of an organized activity. And what I would do was I would go through and see what did they agree on, and where they disagreed and somebody would come up with a one-off thing that they didn't like, I would tend to disregard that stuff. But when they all agreed that this character wasn't working or that plot device wasn't working, that's when you really need to say, okay, I need to fix this. 5 people all agree that this isn't working, then it isn't working. So you really need to listen to your readers, and you need to get a consensus. So you need to have a number of different people read your stuff, and continue studying, continue taking classes from different people, classes on different topics, different ways of writing fiction, and different different genres, just to broaden your mind as much as possible so that you can have as many tools at your disposal as are available to really help you perfect your craft.